Greetings and welcome to the CCP, Creative Cat Productions, where we like to sit on the veranda of history and sip upon the mint juleps of video game nostalgia, but in a way that's cool and totally not racist.
These are good, dude.
And non-alcoholic, because he's under 21.
Today we're talking about Nintendo Force magazine, dude.
It's a video game magazine.
A what now?
Once upon a time, video game magazines were one of the most prominent features of any good magazine rack. At the grocery store, the drug store, the bookstores at the mall, alongside Better Homes and Gardens, Time, Newsweek, Gun and Ammo, and all those car magazines with all the hot chicks, there were tons of video game magazines in the United States. I remember that the two biggest rivals were GamePro, which was kick-started in May of 1989, right before the launch of the Genesis and TurboGrafx 16, and the other was Electronic Gaming Monthly, or EGM for short, which also launched in May of 1989 with this tantalizing first issue.
This is one of the worst looking covers I've ever seen, dude.
Indeed it is. Of course, video game console makers were keen on promoting their brands through their own magazines as well. Sega Visions ran from 1990 to 1995. I vividly remember that first issue, which boldly and prophetically declared that Sega was for the 90s, more than a year before Tom Kalinski's arrival at Sega of America.
Talk about a bodacious cover, dude.
But no game company was better at propagandizing their own brand through the printed media than Nintendo. Nintendo Power was Nintendo's official magazine, which ran from August of 1988 to August of 2012. A period of 24 years.
That's more than 21 years, dude. It could, buy a beer.
Nintendo Power had great production values, and was kind of a bi-monthly strategy guide for many of Nintendo's best games. The magazine was loaded with colorful maps, walkthroughs, cheat codes, comic strips, and every issue even came with a poster that you could hang on your bedroom wall, or even inside of your gym locker at school. And the magazine was very popular. According to many sources, Nintendo had over 6 million readers by the end of 1990, which would have made it one of the very top magazines in the United States. But by 2012, Nintendo Power's circulation dropped to less than 1/2 of 1 million, and thus, production was halted. Around this same time period, the rest of the video game magazine industry also disappeared, at least in the United States, where high-profile gaming websites like IGN and GameSpot began to take their place. While magazines periodically offered gamers critical information about news and upcoming games, they could not compete with gaming websites, which offered the exact same information, but in real time, with fresh daily or even hourly updates of new information. Further, websites could showcase hundreds of screenshots of games, and even actual video footage of gameplay, or elaborate game trailers. And on top of all that, and really driving the last nail in the printed media's coffin, this information was all pretty much free, just as long as you could stand an advertisement every so often. Buying magazines just didn't seem to make any sense by comparison. Yet, if you talk to anyone who remembers these old magazines, they were a big part of the fun of playing video games in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. If you were a subscriber, getting a new issue every month was like Christmas coming 12 times a year, especially if you were like me and subscribed to multiple magazines all at the same time.
Wow, Merry Christmas, dude.
To us, these magazines were more than just information about current video games being sold in stores, but they were the bedrock of an entire burgeoning video game culture, rife with its own lexicon, imagery, rituals, inside jokes, and fun personalities. If video games were our cult, then these magazines were our sacred scriptures. The fundamental cultural driving force that transformed gamers into gamers, setting them apart as a unique subspecies of geekdom. At least, this was the case for several decades. But those days are behind us now, and today, even more than the big gaming websites like IGN or Kotaku, it's actually YouTube and social media that drives gaming culture forward. However, in spite of all these years and all these changes, there are still those of us who lament the loss of printed gaming magazines, and the anticipation of something arriving in our mailboxes other than bills and flyers for our local Chinese restaurants.
Hey, General So, the Peking Garden Express on Viscount says that you're a chicken, dude. Are you gonna, stand for that?
This is an outrage. $5. General Toy reached $15.
Check it out, dude. General So's only $5.
He certainly is. But you know what's also only $5? And totally not chicken? Nintendo Force Magazine. Nintendo Force Magazine isn't a website, as you can see. It's an actual tangible bi-monthly publication that comes in the mail. And let me tell you, our 4 kids love this. Whenever a new issue arrives, everyone gets all excited and they start running around and shouting, declaring themselves to be the first to get to read it. But then I come and take it before it becomes a fight, and we all gather around the hearth so we can share tales about the development of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild Part 2, and how it's actually a real game and not just a figment of the imagination. It's a good time. So what's the deal with Nintendo Force? The first issue of Nintendo Force was released in January of 2013 as a direct consequence of the cancellation of Nintendo Power in 2012. It is a bi-monthly magazine, meaning new issues are printed every 2 months, which is of course 6 issues a year. As of creating this video, Nintendo Force is on issue 59, which just so happens to be all about sports games.
Everyone's favorite, right?
Every issue is created with high-quality production values, professional layouts, and includes more than 80 pages of content covering Nintendo news, previews, reviews, interviews, letters, and even comic strips. In other words, Nintendo Force essentially contains most everything that would have gone into a full-fledged issue of Nintendo Power. Indeed, just like Nintendo Power, every issue of Nintendo Force comes with a poster. Over the last several issues, our kids have been collecting a series of posters that can be combined to form a mural depicting every character from Super Smash Bros. Ultimate for the Switch. Check this out. Now this was a very fun feature for our family. Each issue of Nintendo Force is also professionally written. Contributors include staff writers from such popular sources as Destructoid, IGN, OneUp.com, and various Nintendo-centered websites. The main man behind every issue of Nintendo Force, however, and the magazine's founder, is Lucas M. Thomas, a former editor at IGN that specialized in Nintendo games, who also happens to be a current reporter at the Courier and Press in Evansville, Indiana. He also has 4 kids, which is amazing because so too do I. Anyway, it's clear that for Lucas M. Thomas and all of his contributing writers, that the production of Nintendo Force is, above all, a labor of love for and by people who lament the loss of Nintendo Power. There are even contributions from prominent Nintendo-oriented YouTube personalities, such as Arlo, everyone's favorite video game playing Muppet, which just demonstrates how much Nintendo Power meant to the community, and how many people are willing to work toward bringing it back from the dead. I mean, an alliance between men and Muppets is no small thing, not since CGI became so prominent and put so many Muppets out of work. They've been pissed for years. You'd think that having the first ever Muppet for a president would have assuaged their frustrations, but not really. They just make more demands. So it's good that we can at least find some common ground here with Nintendo Force. Unfortunately, despite the excellent production values, professional writing, and overall very high effort, it doesn't seem like Nintendo Force has been the success that I think it deserves to be. At the time of Nintendo Power's cancellation in 2012, the official Nintendo magazine had almost 500,000 subscribers, which was way south of the millions upon millions of readers the magazine once enjoyed in the early 90s. Nintendo Force subscriptions, on the other hand, are handled entirely through Patreon, and to date, even after being in print for over 9 years, Nintendo Force doesn't even have 5,000 subscribers. I mean, that's less than 0.1% of the audience once enjoyed by Nintendo Power in its heyday. By comparison, it's practically zero. Why is this the case? Why does Nintendo Force have such minuscule readership compared to Nintendo Power? Even compared to Nintendo Power at its lowest point? Well, obviously the chief reason is the same as that which drove out the magazine business in the first place. It's the internet. As you know, most gamers spend a lot of time on the internet, and the internet allows for easy and free access to lots of information or any amount of media that anyone could ever want. It's always there, on demand. By contrast, by the time a video game magazine is created, printed and delivered, most of us would have seen or read every bit of news, heard all of the juiciest rumors, seen all of the review scores for every game we care about, not once, but many times over, thanks to sites like Metacritic. Thus, a Johnny-come-lately physical magazine in your mailbox doesn't offer much incentive to read. You already know about everything it could possibly contain, or so it seems. But at the same time, being informed was not the only thing I got out of video game magazines. Like I said, it was a ritual, a cultural practice, and quite possibly the single best thing to ever happen in the bathroom. Just like Lucas M. Thomas and the people at Nintendo Force, we still think there's a place for video game magazines, especially for parents like myself, who enjoy having something fun to read out loud with my kids. Something other than the Necrocomicon Ex Mortis. The last time we read that, we ruined our entire family vacation to the woods. The cleanup was a real pain in the ass, too. The point is, families like ours would like something safer to read out loud that we can all appreciate together. Often, the books I want to read bore my kids, and conversely, I find the books they prefer to be dumb and stupid. But since we all like video games, we find that no one complains about reading Nintendo Force. I think that by marketing Nintendo Force toward kids and families, that they could really expand their audience significantly. But in order to do this, there are some obstacles that Nintendo Force must overcome, because while Nintendo Force is an excellent homage to the legacy of the now-defunct Nintendo Power, it's not exactly created with a child-friendly audience in mind. Which is a shame, because Nintendo Power at its height was in fact a publication designed specifically for kids. So let's examine an issue of Nintendo Force and see what it's like to actually read one, talk about what they get right, and then we'll offer some suggestions for improvements that we think might help the magazine reach a larger audience, an audience which I believe should be mainly kids. Here is a copy of Nintendo Force, the latest issue as of making this video. This is issue number 59, the Sports Resort issue for May and June of 2022. As with all copies of Nintendo Force, this issue features some high-quality cover art that is every bit as good as the best game magazines of the past. Since this month is all about sports games, they decided to feature Mario Strikers Battle League, which is a new Nintendo-themed football game with very liberal rules and a heavy emphasis on violence. It sounds awesome. Anyway, here's a list of this issue's contents, which are featured as if this were a magazine being sold on the rack of an actual shop, which of course it is not. You can only subscribe to Nintendo Force through Patreon, but this banner is the sort of thing that magazines would often use to compete for your attention and money. For instance, this issue says it features information about Kirby and the Forgotten Land, which is probably a review. I'm interested in that, so I buy the issue. Let's open it up and we see a table of contents with page numbers. There are 82 pages in this particular issue. At the bottom of the page is a little tidbit, as they say, telling how since Nintendo Power never included Mario Strikers' game on the cover, Nintendo Force has decided to give this game the front cover treatment. Very cool. The first major section of Nintendo Force, as was often the case with old-school game magazines, is a letters to the editor section called Inbox. Honestly, our family never reads these, but I do recall enjoying these back in the day, because often the letters were really bananas. People would ask stuff like whether or not Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo had a blood code, or they'd write in answers to questions about stuff like whether or not they were going to get a Sega Dreamcast on September 9th, 1999, 9/9/99. Check out what this guy said in Electronic Gaming Monthly back in the day. No, why should I spend $200 on a system that they're going to leave a year later? Now I bought the 32X for about $200, lifetime about a year. Bought a Sega CD for about $200, lifetime about a year. Bought a Saturn, $400, lifetime about a couple of years. Notice the trend? Honestly, dude, you had me at 32X. But let's check out one of these written to Nintendo Force in 2022. It's a response to a poll about sports games. This issue's theme. Benjamin Hilty writes, "Does Rocket League count? If so, yeah, I've played sports games. I think it sure would be awesome if Mario played, wait for it, cornhole. Now I think it would be hilarious to see Bowser trying to land a bag and horribly missing." Wow. Speaking of cornhole and horrible missing, do I have a console suggestion for this guy? Anyway, there's no editorial response. This page is basically just a comment section. There is a bit here on page 5 called Carter's Corner, which has a cute sleeping Kirby graphic, and a guy named Carter fills you in on his favorite Pokemon.
Cool story, Carter.
Turning to page 6, we find a contest winner, and 3 new questions for the next issue's letter section. Next month is going to be all about beat-em-ups. Also, here we can see the Nintendo Force staff credits. There's the editor-in-chief and founder of Nintendo Force, Lucas M. Thomas. There's Evan Campbell, a former freelancer at IGN, and Jonathan Holmes from Destructoid, as well as Maggie Jones-Ludi, and many others. On page 7 is our first comic strip. This is about a me reflecting on the past, and it's created by Matthew Taranto, that drew the Brawl in the Family webcomic that ran from June 2008 to October of 2014. On page 8, we get the news! And here's a weakness for Nintendo Force, because this is 2 full-page articles, one about the cancellation of Advanced Wars due to the war in Ukraine, and the other about the delay of Breath of the Wild 2 until 2023. Not only are we thoroughly aware of both of these issues, we've been aware for quite a while, and don't really desire more details than what we've seen. Editor Lucas, with a me face, offers some editorial reactions to both stories, which is a nice touch. Indeed, I think a reaction to the news by experienced writers is more interesting than the news itself. Page 9 is a favorite of ours, Collector's Corner. This is basically product news, and we always discover something new here. Wow! It looks like we can get a Sonic the Hedgehog stuffy at Build-A-Bear. Now that's pretty cool. I guess that gives us a reason to visit one of America's abandoned malls. Hello? Hello? Is anyone here? Moving on to page 14 is a section called Download, which is dedicated to downloadable content and eShop games. You can typically find all the indie stuff here. Nintendo Force spends a lot of space here, discussing the fact that new features are going to be added to games such as Nintendo Switch Sports at a later date through DLC. This is basically an editorial about downloadable content, and as you can see, this is a fairly long article spread out over 2 pages. The font is also really tiny, which means that Lucas was able to cram more words on the page. I don't know how many words are here, but I think it's way too many. Plus, the tiny font used for Nintendo Force makes lengthy articles like this hard to read. And we all at CCP agree that this is the biggest flaw with pretty much every Nintendo Force article. They're too long, and they're too hard to read, especially for kids. If the font was larger, that is, easier to see, and the length of the articles were cut in half, then reading Nintendo Force would be much more manageable and therefore fun.
This ain't an issue of Harper's Weekly, dude. We don't need to get all philosophical like some 30-minute YouTube video reviewing a video game magazine. Yeah, bro, keep it short and sweet.
If you're an adult used to lengthy articles in the New York Times, then no problem, I guess. But then, if that's really you, then I doubt you have time to read much about video games. But do you know who does have that kind of time? Kids! And that's who really needs to be the target here. Nintendo Force needs to have more graphic content and make articles shorter, simpler, and above all, easier to see. I'm not saying make it stupid. I'm saying make it appropriate for the same demographic that actually plays all these Kirby games. That's all. Here's another example. Page 16 is an overview of sports games that are on the soon-to-be-defunct eShop. Each game has a nice screenshot and a couple of paragraphs describing what it is. Honestly though, it's still a bit much. I would have gone with 1 paragraph, larger font, and I would have radically cut down on this lengthy intro here. On page 19, Nintendo Force begins their reviews of eShop games and DLC. It looks like the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course gets a 9 out of 10. You get 48 new tracks with this thing? Now that's incredible. I would have loved to see more graphical coverage of those tracks. Still, it's impressive. On page 20 is a review for a game called Infernax, which looks pretty cool. It gets 8.5 out of 10. Konami's Getsu Fumaden, Undying Moon, gets a 6.5. Apparently, it's tediously grindy and lacks the features of other side-scrolling roguelike platformers. I like the art style, though. Skipping over to page 26 is a review of Pikmin Bloom for smartphones. I personally enjoy this app, though it's really just an elaborate step counter. They score it a 7 out of 10.
I don't even consider it a video game, dude.
Page 27 is a comic by Thor Thorvaldsen. It's called Dr. Chozo and Samus-chan, and it seems to be based on Akira Toriyama's Dr. Slump manga. Chibi Samus is not supposed to touch the bomb. But it plays music, so she touches it. Then it explodes. She says, "Ouchie." Get it? Then this issue's big featured article starts on page 28 and goes on until page 43. It's a lengthy discussion of Nintendo's history with sports games, going all the way back to the NES and across all the big categories, like soccer, baseball, football, tennis, and so on and so forth. Each sport gets at least one full page, about 4 photos, and a Nintendo Sports icon. Tennis gets 2 pages because of its rich history in video games, and so does baseball. This is a pretty ambitious format, but not all of it is super interesting to me. The baseball section briefly discusses Nintendo's role in saving the Seattle Mariners in the 90s, which is pretty cool, but it probably actually could have benefited from being a little lengthier. Like, instead of broadly trying to write about every Nintendo sports game across 40 years of history, perhaps it would have been better to just pick a couple specific topics that were most interesting. So here we have an example of an article that's not only too long, but it's also unfocused and too broad to be terribly interesting. What you want, ideally, is to tell a compelling story in as few words as possible, and this entire section misses both criteria. If I were going to do an issue like this, dedicated to Nintendo history with sports, then I would have ditched all this traditional news, reviews, and previews stuff, and made something more like a mini historical guide focusing on a few interesting topics under the Nintendo Sports category. It would have been great to expand on the story about Nintendo buying the Seattle Mariners, or how things went with Mike Tyson and Punch-Out! But this confluence of rigid traditional format and broad topics have produced a pretty dry article, and we really couldn't get into it. On page 45 is the previews section. Of course, this covers all of the high-profile games that are coming out in the future for the Switch. Thus, it's a lengthy verbal description of everything that we already saw on the last Nintendo Direct. This issue zeroes in on Mario Strikers, talking about the history of the series and offering some speculation about what might be in the final game. This goes on for 3 full pages. Fire Emblem Warriors 3 gets 2 pages, but the Capcom Fighting Collection only gets half of a page? There's gonna be like 10 games in that thing. It seems like we could have given this more coverage. An article about Darkstalkers and Night Warriors would have been awesome. There's so much they could have done with that. Bummer, dude. Oh well. The announcement of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet gets 2 pages, and there's an interesting comic on page 54 featuring Bonk from the TurboGrafx-16 and a character called Non-Specific Action Figure. It's about breaking legs and body modification surgery. It's pretty dark and not really my thing. I think we're best being grateful with the bodies we have. What a thing to allow envy to thwart your growth as a person. Though I've always thought those bifurcated lizard tongues that some people get were pretty interesting. The dudes that get that surgery are always in my first round of suspects when evil deeds are afoot. Yeah, that's the guy. Retro is a section of Nintendo Force that covers Nintendo's glorious past. And in this issue, it's all about old sports games. Like that totally nuts Mega Man soccer game. What a concept that was. Especially the fact that every player looks exactly like Mega Man. And then there's Warp Zone on page 58, where the editors talk about stuff that was talked about in old issues of Nintendo Power. So here we've moved on from talking about sports games to talking about how Nintendo Power once talked about sports games. Now that's meta. Page 59 features yet another comic. This time it's about the word strike and how some characters are called striker. So it sounds like they must be on strike or bowlers or something. If you ask me, reading most of these Nintendo Force comic strips is punishment. Get it? See what I did there? Punishment?
Whoa, forgive me. Now I failed you all.
And then on page 60 is our favorite feature of every issue of Nintendo Force, at least my personal favorite section, and that's the interview. This issue features Igor Simic, an indie developer from Yugoslavia who's most famous for creating Golf Club Wasteland, a critically acclaimed game available on the Nintendo Switch. Actually, outstanding interviews with indie developers are typical in Nintendo Force, and it's one section of the magazine that presents authentically fresh content for readers. Previews and reviews are redundant in the internet age, and stuff like retro commentary is a dime a dozen. I mean, we would know, right? But getting exclusive insights from young, talented game developers? That kind of information is truly amazing. This particular interview is only a page of dense text, but many others are much longer in other issues. In this issue, Igor Simic discusses his storytelling philosophy, the inspiration for Golf Club Wasteland, and offers advice for new game developers. It's great stuff. On page 62 is another comic. It's about violently aggressive Princess Daisy, who's upset about being cut from the latest Mario Strikers game. The art is in the CalArts style, so it's got a lot going against it in my book, and this is my book. And finally, on page 63, begins the most prized portion of any gaming magazine.
The tips and tricks section?
No, dude, that would have been awesome, but no, this is the review section, where we find out about which games are good.
Find out? What do you mean find out? We already know, dog.
Well, yes, but we don't know what Nintendo Force thinks about these games.
But that's like one opinion, dude. I've got Metacritic, YouTube, the comment section on Twitter. Just watching the gameplay footage says more than enough, man.
But this is the review section.
Okay, later, dude. We're gonna go play some, like, Dusk Till Dawn. Later, Gator.
Right. Anyway, this review section is dedicated to sports games. There are 2 massive pages dedicated to MLB The Show 2022. According to Nintendo Force, this is a must-buy game, scoring 8.5 out of 10. Then there are 3 monster pages dedicated to Nintendo Switch Sports, the long-awaited follow-up to the classic Wii Sports game from 2006. Lucas scores the game 7.5 out of 10, lamenting the lack of popular Wii Sports categories such as 100-pin bowling. There's also a review for Atelier Sophie 2, The Alchemist of the Mysterious Dream, an RPG that, despite bugs and glitches that required the game to be restarted, scores a solid 8 out of 10 on the basis of other merits. To me, an 8 out of 10 seems a little high for a game like this, but that's pretty much in line with the Metacritic score for the same game, so I guess we gotta let it go. Same with Nintendo Switch Sports. That seems like it's in the ballpark. But the 8.5 out of 10 score for MLB 2022 seems way off the mark. Nintendo Life gave this game like a 6 out of 10. And this brings me to one of our biggest issues with Nintendo Force, the somewhat overly high review scores. Nintendo Force gives out a lot of 8, 9, and 10 out of 10 scores. To me, an 8 out of 10 is highly recommended, but 9 or 10 is basically a must-buy. So check out some of these games that Nintendo Force thinks I ought to run out and purchase with my hard-earned money. Bravely Default 2. Really? This is just another Final Fantasy game, but with mobile phone level art and graphics. This looks like something a guy wearing a fedora would play. And I sold my fedora years ago. Catherine Full Body. What's with this dude's eyes? Nah, man. I think this game's mechanics look pretty cool, but thematically, this game is not for me. I think it's supposed to be funny, but it comes off more like sex offender creepy to me. Super Mario Kart Live. You know what? I bought this for my kids, and I guess it's pretty impressive, but it's still basically just a remote control car you control with your Switch, and it really requires that you have huge flat living space to set up the track. This is more for like diehard fans of this concept and not really a must-have game in my opinion. Mario Golf. Dude, I'm sorry, but this is a golf game. This is a specialty game with pretty limited appeal for me. New Pokemon Snap. No way. It's just a Pokemon-themed rail shooter without guns. This is for fans only. No More Heroes 3. Okay, so no doubt this game is cool and wacky, but is it really a must-buy? It's mostly zany postmodern Japanese minigames.
No More Heroes? More like No More Chances.
Yeah, let's move on. How about Legends of Heroes, Trails of Cold Steel 3? What? What even is this? I guess if you really love generic RPGs, but I'm not really sure this is a must-buy either. In this issue, Triangle Strategy gets a 9 out of 10, but it's got an 8 out of 10 on Metacritic. The new Kirby and the Forgotten Land is great. I give it a 9 out of 10, but Nintendo Force says it's 10 out of 10. Gaming perfection. Despite the same reviewer saying that the mini-bosses are reused too much, and that Kirby's new Mouthful mode lacks variety. 10 out of 10 is essentially a flawless game that serves as a landmark achievement, changing the way we view games forever. The Ocarina of Time in 1998, that was a 10 out of 10 game. Kirby and the Forgotten Land no doubt is an outstanding 3D platformer, but it doesn't really do anything that games like Mario Odyssey haven't already done years ago. It's definitely a must-play, but it's not literally one of the greatest games ever made. And again, if we look back at the Metacritic scores online, we see that they're far more realistic. Nintendo Force scores are all just a little bit too high, pretty much across the board. And this is yet another problem with standalone video game magazines. And it's one reason they eventually went extinct. You only get one or a few people's perspectives, and thus opinions are going to be questionable. Humans have a deep-seated need for mob verification and social approval, not because the mob is necessarily right. In fact, the mob is frequently wrong. But it's just that social cohesion is at the very root of our evolutionary determined psychosocial behavior. You show me that one guy at Nintendo Force that thinks Kirby and the Forgotten Land is a masterpiece, one of the best games ever made, and I will squint, being unsure and skeptical. But when you have 22 professional critics and over 7,000 users tell me that The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time is one of the greatest games of all time, then I'm inclined to not just agree, but I'm inclined to run out and get a tattoo while I synthesize the Ocarina of Time into the very fabric of my worldview and way of life. I'm gonna let it define me. And yes, no matter what we say, we are all this stupid. It's the nature of cult, which is at the root of all culture. But we can't help that, and thus individual review scores in a single game magazine are, by themselves, practically meaningless. And thus they are a waste of time and space for both the authors and the readers who won't care anyway. Look at this, 2 full-size pages in tiny font just to tell me that Star Wars Lego is 9 out of 10? Bullshit. All I'm gonna do is read this one magic aggregate number on Metacritic, which confirms my deepest suspicions. It's an 8 out of 10. Is that shallow? Yes, of course. But millions upon millions of years of evolutionary history have generated man as he is. And man will, apparently, tend to do or believe pretty much anything just as long as we believe there's a consensus within our social identity group. In fact, almost all of us wouldn't know what to say we believed about anything without such a consensus. And that's not necessarily bad or good, it just is. But it sucks for game magazines like Nintendo Force because they can't compete with the collective body of online articles or aggregate score websites such as Metacritic. And so my recommendation to Nintendo Force is don't. Don't try and use lots of words to describe why you think Rune Factory 5 is a worse game than Lego Star Wars. It's a waste of energy and my time. You have to exploit the unexploited in terms of potential content here. A good example of doing just that can be found on page 78 of this issue, the community section, which is great. Here Nintendo Force covers all the weird and cool stuff Nintendo fans are doing to celebrate their favorite brand. Stuff like making fan games of their favorite franchises, something Nintendo officially frowns upon sadly, or any of the other cool stuff that people have done to preserve or forward the history of gaming. For instance, here's a great article about fans of Tecmo Bowl for the NES, updating the game with the current NFL roster. In fact, for nearly 15 years, Tecmo Bowl fans have been ROM hacking Tecmo Super Bowl in order to make it reflect changes in the actual NFL. I've heard of fantasy football, but this is taking it to the next level. What an awesome testament to the best football game of the 8-bit era. And I never would have even found out about this, or TecmoBowl.org, without subscribing to Nintendo Force magazine. And then there's another article here about how fans have remastered the original Super Mario Bros. Animated movie from 1986 to 4K quality and uploaded it to YouTube, along with English subtitles. Nintendo Force includes a link and everything. How badass is that? So if you can't wait for Chris Pratt's interpretation of Mario, or Seth Rogen's Donkey Kong, then perhaps a viewing of Super Mario Bros. Peach, Hime, Kyushutsu, Daisakusen will do it for you. It seems like it's actually a pretty decent kids movie. And it settles an age-old question as well. Does Mario break those blocks with his fist, or is he ramming them with his head? This anime demonstrates unequivocally that he's smashing them with his head. Perhaps that red cap of his is hard like a helmet. Who knows? Moving on, page 81 features a comic about Wario and Waluigi. It looks like this Wiggler is pretty good at kicking soccer balls. And that's about it. Page 82 is just a preview of the next issue for July and August, which will be about beat-em-ups. And thus ends our tour of Nintendo Force Magazine, issue number 59. For $5 an issue, we get 6 issues a year, each with its own impressive poster, excellent professional page layouts, great artwork, and numerous lengthy articles from professional games journalists striving to keep the Nintendo Power legacy alive into the present. At this price and with this much content, more than 80 pages of content, and with this level of quality, we at Creative Cat Productions have come to regard Nintendo Force as a must-read publication for Nintendo fans and Switch owners, especially those with kids looking for decent reading material that can be taken with them in the car or to boring meetings and times of dull waiting. But there's room for improvement, and we think that Nintendo Force could make changes toward making their magazine more readable and appealing, which could help attract a much larger subscriber base on Patreon. We think Nintendo Force needs to be geared less toward media-saturated millennials who might be nostalgic for Nintendo Power, and instead more towards the kids of today who currently actually have the free time to enjoy reading a magazine that's dedicated entirely to the Nintendo Switch and its games. This means that articles need to be shorter and easier to read. The type font desperately needs to be increased in size. Even with my glasses, my eyes feel like exploding after reading about 3 paragraphs of this tiny font. Further, Nintendo Force's content needs to move away from the old conventional model of news and reviews that once dominated the gaming magazines of the past. That sort of content made sense prior to the internet boom of the mid to late 90s, because back then there was no other source for that kind of information. But today, that information is woefully redundant by the time a bi-monthly periodical reaches your mailbox. Instead, we think Nintendo Force should emphasize its strengths, such as its historical overviews of fun gaming topics related to Nintendo, the in-depth interviews with contemporary game developers, coverage of exciting new updates in the fan community, and more editorial or opinion-based content related to questions and ideas that cannot be easily sidestepped by simply looking up a number on an aggregate site like Metacritic.com. We also think Nintendo Force should create even more room for artwork, screenshots, maps, and even more comics. There also needs to be a section that covers tips and tricks, or even glitches, that gamers can exploit or recreate for themselves. This was an aspect of Nintendo Power that was absolutely vital to that magazine's popularity, and yet it's inexplicably missing here. Things like walkthroughs or tutorials could make the magazine seem vital, seem like it actually is a force to be reckoned with. Perhaps games are both too easy and too large for such things in 2022, but I don't know, a few colored maps would be amazing fun to pore over with my kids, regardless of their necessity. Finally, we think that Nintendo Force could use a few activity pages with games or even crafts related to Nintendo products. Nintendo Force could become something akin to a Nintendo-themed highlights magazine. If Nintendo Force featured fun elements that could draw the interest of kids, like these Wildcrats magazines I'm always conned into at the grocery store, then we think that Nintendo Force could shift away from being a neato curiosity to becoming a practical necessity for families, with both children and Nintendo Switches. Anyway, have you all ever heard of Nintendo Force magazine? Have you ever read an issue? Does it interest you in any way? And what did you think of our overview of issue number 59? Please let us know what you think and more in the comments. And thank you all very much for watching. Bye bye now.